The late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the dry earth, casting long, slanting shadows from the fence posts that lined Claire's small ranch. The air hung heavy with the scent of dust and dry grass, a scent that had clung to this land for months now. Claire's boots crunched on the gravel as she made her way down the narrow dirt path toward her modest home. The long day's exhaustion weighed on her shoulders. Her hands, calloused from hours of struggling with the unyielding land, itched for rest. But as she approached the wooden fence that bordered her property, a faint, agonized whinny sliced through the stillness, sharp and desperate. Claire froze, her breath catching. She scanned the horizon, heart pounding. There, barely visible in the dying light, something stirred near the fence, a shape hunched low, trembling, caught in a cruel tangle of rope and wire. Moving closer, she saw it was a wild mare, her coat a patchwork of dirt and dried blood, ribs pressing painfully against taut skin. The mare's eyes, wide and glassy, told a story of suffering, yet flickered with a spark of wild defiance. Kneeling slowly, Claire's fingers brushed the mare's coarse mane. The animal flinched, muscles taut, but made no move to resist. Her hooves, cracked and bruised, scraped weakly against the earth. The sight twisted something deep inside Claire, a pang of recognition, a surge of helplessness, but also a fierce, unspoken resolve. Tied to the fence post was a small scrap of paper, fluttering faintly in the breeze. With trembling hands, Claire untied it and unfolded the note. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. Someone had written in desperation, "Please save her. She is all I have left." The words hit Claire harder than she expected. She looked back at the mare, whose breathing was ragged but steady. Who had left this creature here, and why? And why did the note feel like a whispered plea reaching out across more than just the miles? Claire stood, casting her gaze across the fence line to the neighboring hills, where shadows deepened into night. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. This was no ordinary animal left for disposal. This was a story, a cry for help, and maybe a chance for something to change. Her mind drifted back to her father, the man who had raised her on this very land. His strong hands, weathered but gentle, had taught her how to read horses. The flick of an ear, the subtle shift of weight, the quiet courage behind wild eyes. But he was gone now, taken by a sickness that left a hollow no one could fill. Claire's grief was a constant ache, a background hum beneath the struggles of the ranch. Since his passing, the ranch had been slipping through her fingers. Drought had withered the crops, bills stacked higher than the fences, and loneliness wrapped itself around the evenings like a thick fog. Yet, despite it all, Claire had never stopped believing in the lessons her father gave her, that survival wasn't just about endurance, but about hope, about fighting for what mattered, even when the odds were against you. The mare, fragile and wild, seemed to embody that very struggle. She was broken, yet not defeated. Claire's gaze dropped to the frayed rope binding the mare. She could leave the animal here to face whatever fate awaited in the coming night. The harsh cold, the prowling coyotes, the slow march toward death. Or she could take a risk that might cost her the little she had left, but could also mean saving a life, and perhaps healing a part of her own. Her hands clenched into fists. She thought of the note again. Someone had trusted her, or maybe just hoped against hope that she would do the right thing. A breeze stirred the dry grass, carrying with it a whisper of memories. The sound of her father's voice teaching her patience, teaching her kindness, teaching her the language of horses. She could almost see his silhouette against the horizon, steady and unwavering. Claire took a deep breath. The ache in her heart shifted, fueled now by determination instead of despair. She knelt beside the mare once more, voice soft and steady. "It's okay, girl. I'm here now." Slowly, she began to untie the rope. The mare tensed, but there was no fight in her. Instead, she seemed to surrender, as if relief had finally found her after a long, lonely journey. The sky above deepened into twilight, stars beginning to prick the dark canvas with faint light. Claire lifted the mare's weary weight, guiding her toward the shelter of the barn. Each step was slow and careful. The mare stumbled, but Claire steadied her with quiet words and firm hands. In the barn, Claire lit a lantern, its soft glow casting shadows on the rough wooden walls. She fetched clean water in an old trough and fresh hay. The mare lowered her head to drink, eyes closing in exhaustion. Claire watched, heart pounding with a mixture of sorrow and hope. This fragile creature, abandoned and broken, had just crossed a threshold from death toward something new. And so had Claire. As the night deepened, Claire settled beside the mare, wrapping a worn blanket around her trembling body. She thought again about the note, about the person who had left this desperate message. What story had they carried? What pain had driven them to let go of the only thing they had left? But questions could wait. For now, the mare needed her. And Claire, in this quiet moment, felt a flicker of purpose ignite within. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the promise of change. Somewhere between loss and hope, a new journey had begun. Claire's eyes reflected the lantern's glow as she whispered, "We'll get through this. Together." The night held its breath, and the story was just beginning. The dawn crept slowly over the horizon, casting pale light across the weathered barn, where Claire sat beside the mare. The morning air was cool but carried a fragile warmth, like the tentative hope stirring within her. Shadow, as Claire had begun to call the mare, stirred faintly, her breath shallow and uneven. The wounds along her flanks still oozed faintly, and her ribs pressed painfully beneath her patchy coat. But there was life, a stubborn flicker, that refused to be snuffed out. Claire's hands moved with practiced gentleness, cleaning the wounds and applying ointment made from herbs she had learned to gather with her father. Each touch was an unspoken promise, a silent plea for strength. As Shadow's eyes met hers, a fragile trust began to form, a thread weaving two broken souls together. Outside, the ranch stretched out like a patchwork quilt of cracked earth and dry grass, a place both beautiful and unforgiving. Claire's gaze wandered over the hills, where wild horses once roamed freely. Those untamed creatures, like Shadow, had always embodied the spirit of survival, and now one of them lay broken at her feet. Despite the quiet morning, tension buzzed beneath the surface. Claire was painfully aware that resources were scarce. Every dollar spent on Shadow's care chipped away at the fragile lifeline, holding the ranch together. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Saving this wild mare was a gamble, one she might not be able to afford, but her heart refused to let go. Later that day, Claire trudged toward the neighboring farm, a humble property owned by Tom, a man whose reputation as a retired horse trainer was as solid as the land beneath their feet. Tom was a man shaped by years of hard labor and quiet regret, his weathered face etched with lines that told stories Claire longed to understand. Tom greeted her with a wary nod, his sharp eyes flicking toward Shadow, who stood tentatively by the fence. "You've got your work cut out," he said gruffly, voice rough but not unkind. Claire swallowed, steadying herself. "She's been through hell. I'm not sure she'll make it." Tom studied the mare with a critical eye, then glanced back at Claire. Wild horses don't give up easy. They fight, even when it seems they've lost everything. His words struck a chord deep inside her. She thought of her father, who had taught her to see beyond the surface, to understand the quiet strength hiding beneath wild eyes. She nodded slowly. "I want to help her fight." Over the following days, Claire and Tom worked side by side. Tom's hands, calloused yet skilled, taught Claire how to read Shadow's subtle signals, when she needed space, when she craved comfort. Their conversations were sparse but meaningful, filled with the kind of understanding that comes from shared hardship. Claire's mornings were consumed with feeding Shadow and tending to her wounds. Each small victory, Shadow taking a sip of water from her hand, standing a little steadier, felt like a triumph. But there were setbacks too. The mare's legs trembled with weakness, and a flare-up of infection sent Claire scrambling for remedies. Nights were restless, filled with quiet prayers and whispered encouragements. One afternoon, as Claire brushed the mare's dusty coat, memory swept over her like a sudden storm. She recalled the stories her father told her about mustangs, wild, free, but also survivors of pain and hardship. Shadow embodied that spirit, but there was something more, a sadness that clung to her, a story left untold. Curiosity gnawed at Claire. Who had left the mare tied to her fence? Why that note? She began asking neighbors in cautious whispers, but no one seemed to know. Some shook their heads, others offered sympathetic glances. The mystery deepened, entwining itself with Claire's own struggle. Tom watched her closely. One evening, as they repaired a broken fence together, he spoke quietly. Sometimes, the past doesn't want to stay buried. It finds a way to reach out. Claire looked at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. Do you think the note was a plea? From someone who cared? Tom shrugged, the weight of unspoken stories in his silence. Maybe. Or maybe it was a last hope, left when all else failed. That night, Claire lay awake, shadow resting nearby, fragile but alive. The ranch was quiet except for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Claire's thoughts wandered to the man who had left the note. Was he out there still watching? Or had he passed on, leaving only a desperate hope tied to a dying mare? Despite the uncertainty, a new determination settled within her. Saving Shadow was no longer just about the horse. It was about honoring a promise she had never made, about fighting for something beyond herself. The days that followed brought small but significant changes. Shadow's strength grew, her eyes brighter with each passing dawn. Claire found herself talking aloud to the mare, sharing her fears, her dreams, the quiet grief she carried like a shadow. And slowly, the walls around Claire's heart began to crumble. One morning, Tom arrived with an old saddle and a weathered bridle. "Time to teach her trust," he said simply. Claire hesitated. The idea of riding Shadow felt like stepping into a new world, one filled with both hope and risk. But the mare looked at her with an almost knowing gaze, as if inviting her to try. Together, they worked through the awkward beginnings, Shadow's tentative steps, Claire's tentative hands. There were moments of frustration, of doubt, when it seemed the distance between wildness and trust was too great to bridge. But then, just as the sun dipped low, casting a fiery glow across the ranch, Shadow stood still beneath Claire, calm and steady. The bond was fragile, but it was real. Yet, just as hope began to take root, the ranch faced a new threat. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a fierce storm. Winds whipped through the trees, and the first heavy drops of rain fell, soaking the cracked earth. Claire worked feverishly to secure the fences and shelter for Shadow. But in the chaos, the mare panicked, breaking loose from her stall and disappearing into the wild night. Panic surged through Claire's veins. The storm roared around her as she plunged into the darkness, calling Shadow's name over and over. Fear clawed at her, the weight of failure threatening to crush the fragile hope they'd built. Hours passed in a blur of rain and thunder until, at last, a soft whinny answered her desperate calls. Shadow stood at the edge of the woods, soaked and trembling but alive. Claire rushed forward, wrapping her arms around the mare's shivering form. The storm had tested them both, but neither had broken. As the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, Claire whispered, "We'll get through this. Together." The night held its breath, the promise of a new day waiting just beyond the darkness. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the past, secrets waited to be uncovered, secrets that would change everything. The morning after the storm arrived crisp and clear. The ranch bathed in the soft glow of dawn. Claire sat on the porch, her fingers tracing the grain of the weathered wood, thoughts tangled like the wild grasses beyond the fence. Shadow was resting in the stable, her breathing steady now, but the ordeal of the night before had left an ache deeper than the mare's bruises. As Claire sipped her coffee, the memory of Shadow's desperate eyes haunted her. It wasn't just the mare's fight to survive that captivated her. It was the invisible chain binding both their pasts, a silent story waiting to be unraveled. The note, the stranger who had entrusted her with this fragile life. Questions pressed on Claire's mind like weighty stones. Determined to find answers, she set out toward the town's edge, where a cluster of old ranches huddled like forgotten relics. Among them was a small, neglected homestead rumored to belong to a man named James Harper. The locals spoke his name in hushed tones, an enigmatic figure who had vanished months ago, leaving behind an empty house and whispers of heartbreak. Claire's heart tightened as she approached the peeling porch, her boots stirring the dust of a place frozen in time. She noticed the chipped paint and the rusted hinges, but what caught her eye was a faded photograph pinned to the bulletin board by the door. It showed a man and a mare standing side by side, James and a striking horse with a wild gaze that seemed hauntingly familiar. Her breath caught. Could this be Shadow's story? Just then, footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Claire turned to see Tom emerging from the shadows, his weathered face shaded beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Thought I'd find you here," he said quietly. James was a good man, but life wore him down. Tom's voice held a mixture of sorrow and respect. He loved that horse like family, but circumstances tore them apart. From what I heard, James tried everything to save her, but the weight of the world was too much. Claire nodded, absorbing the weight of those words. She felt the invisible threads pulling tighter, the bond between the mare, her lost owner, and herself. They stood together in silence, the morning breeze carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain. Claire knew then that her mission had grown beyond mere survival. She wasn't just saving a horse, she was preserving a legacy. Back at the ranch, the days blurred into a routine of care and cautious progress. Claire and Tom worked tirelessly, their efforts stitched together by shared determination. Tom's old saddle creaked beneath Claire as she learned to ride Shadow, their movements initially awkward, but gradually becoming a dance of trust. Each moment on Shadow's back was a lesson in patience. The mare's wild spirit surfaced in sudden flinches and nervous twitches, but Claire met each challenge with steady hands and gentle words. Their connection deepened, unspoken but undeniable. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the leaves, Tom and Claire prepared for a test, a local endurance ride that would push both rider and horse to their limits. Tom's voice was firm yet encouraging. "This is more than a race. It's a way to prove to yourself what you're capable of, and to Shadow that she's not alone anymore." Claire swallowed, the knot of fear tightening in her throat. She thought of her father, of James, of the countless battles both horses and humans fought alone. The endurance ride was a chance to rewrite the ending, not just for Shadow, but for herself. The morning of the event arrived with a pale sky and fresh breeze. The crowd gathered, murmurs rippling through the air as spectators eyed the unlikely pair, Claire, a young woman clinging to hope, and Shadow, the wild mare learning to trust. The whistle blew, and they were off. The trail twisted through forests and rocky paths, each step demanding balance, strength, and heart. Shadows of doubt crept in as Shadow stumbled, muscles protesting after long neglect. Claire's voice broke through the tension, steady and calm. "We're in this together, one step at a time." Hours passed, fatigue clawing at their limbs, but neither yielded. At a water stop, Claire caught her breath and looked down at Shadow, whose eyes met hers with a fierce glint of determination. It was more than survival, it was transformation. The final stretch loomed, a steep incline that tested every ounce of resolve. Claire gritted her teeth, pushing herself and Shadow beyond the limits they'd known. Memories flashed, her father's encouragement, Tom's steady presence, James's silent hope etched in the note tied to the fence. At the summit, breath ragged and muscles trembling, they crossed the finish line. The crowd erupted, but Claire's gaze stayed locked on Shadow, whose wild spirit had softened into a quiet strength. Later, as they rested under the fading light, Claire unfolded the note again, fingers tracing the faded ink. The truth settled over her like a gentle rain. The man who left the note was gone, but his wish lived on through Shadow, and now, through Claire. Tom's words echoed softly. "Sometimes, saving one means saving us all." In that moment, Claire understood the depth of the journey, the intertwining of lives, loss, and hope. Shadow was no longer just a mare fighting for life. She was a symbol of resilience, a bridge between past and future. The night crept in, stars blinking awake overhead. Claire sat beside Shadow, the bond between them unbreakable. There were still challenges ahead, shadows yet to face, but for the first time in a long while, hope felt tangible. The story was far from over, and as the ranch settled into quiet, a new chapter began, one written not in words, but in trust, courage, and the enduring power of second chances. The dawn broke with a quiet promise. painting the sky in soft hues of rose and gold. Claire stood at the edge of the ranch, Shadow beside her, muscles taut and breath steady. Today was the day of the final test, the endurance ride that would define their journey. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of every hardship, every triumph, pressing into this single moment. Claire's fingers tightened around the reins as she gazed at the winding trail ahead. The path was unforgiving, steep inclines, rocky terrain, and stretches where the sun would beat down mercilessly. Yet it was more than just a physical challenge. It was a reckoning of spirit, hers and Shadow's. Years of pain and neglect met the chance for redemption, and neither could afford to falter. Tom approached quietly, his weathered face set in a rare expression of encouragement. "You're ready," he said simply, his voice steady with conviction. "Remember, it's not just about speed or strength. It's about trust between you and her." Claire nodded, swallowing the knot of nerves tightening her throat. She thought of the note left tied to the fence months ago, the desperate plea that had set everything in motion, the story of a man who had loved his mare so fiercely, even as life tore them apart. That memory fueled her resolve. As the starting whistle pierced the morning calm, Claire nudged Shadow forward. The mare responded, ears flicking back and forth, eyes bright with a mixture of fear and determination. Step by step, they moved into the wilderness, the rhythm of hooves pounding against earth mingling with Claire's steady breaths. The trail tested them immediately. Loose stones shifted beneath Shadow's hooves, threatening to send her tumbling. Claire leaned forward, whispering calm assurances, her hands firm but gentle. Every stumble was met with patience, every falter with unwavering support. The wildness that had once been Shadow's refuge now wrestled with the trust growing between them. Hours passed in a blur of sun and sweat, muscles screaming beneath the strain. Claire's legs burned, but she pushed on, fueled by memories of her father's voice, steady, guiding, reminding her that resilience was born from struggle. She glanced down at Shadow, whose coat gleamed with sweat, eyes never leaving her rider. At the halfway point, the trail narrowed alongside a sheer drop. The wind whipped sharply, and Shadow hesitated, nostrils flaring. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She reached down, brushing the mare's neck, murmuring softly, "I'm here. We're together." A deep breath, a slow step forward. The bond between them held fast. The final stretch was the hardest, steep and unforgiving. Claire's body begged for rest, but the thought of giving up was a shadow she refused to entertain. She thought of Tom's words, of James Harper's hope etched in that faded note, and most of all, of the quiet strength she had found in Shadow. As they crested the summit, the valley spread out below them in a breathtaking panorama. The crowd gathered at the finish line erupted in cheers, but Claire barely heard them. Her eyes were locked on Shadow's steady gaze. The wild spirit softened now into a fierce, unyielding strength. They crossed the line together, breath ragged but hearts full. The victory was more than a finish. It was a testament to their journey, a celebration of survival and trust. Later, as twilight painted the sky in lavender and deep blue, Claire found herself alone with Shadow near the old fence where it all began. She knelt beside her, voice low and filled with emotion. "We made it. Together." Her fingers traced the mare's mane, soft beneath her touch. Shadow nuzzled her gently, a silent promise of the bond they shared. Claire's thoughts drifted back to the man who had left that note, his desperate hope, his final act of faith. She knew his story had ended, but through Shadow and her own courage, a new chapter had begun. In the quiet that followed, the ranch felt alive with possibility. The drought that had once threatened to consume it seemed less daunting. The loneliness that shadowed Claire's days lifted, replaced by the steady rhythm of healing and hope. Tom's presence lingered nearby, a steady anchor in the shifting tides of change. His weathered smile held the hint of new beginnings, not just for Claire and Shadow, but for himself as well. As stars blinked awake overhead, Claire stood, a gentle wind tugging at her hair. She gazed toward the horizon, heart steady and eyes bright. Sometimes the deepest wounds become the source of the greatest strength. Sometimes trust and resilience carve paths through the darkest storms. And sometimes All it takes is one lost soul to remind us what it means to be found. The story was far from over, but for now, hope was enough. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.